Hello everyone. In this session, I'm going to look at the governance aspects of stress testing. Okay, we already know that stress testing is very much an essential aspect in the risk management process. Now, the technical side of stress testing is about the various kinds of tests that needs to be performed, right? The various scenarios that need to be created, the various exposures that need to be looked at, etc. But at the same time, what is the role of the governance process, which involves the board of directors, right? The senior management. What is the way they need to look at the stress testing? If at all stress testing need to be successful in an organization, what is the role of the governance team with respect to stress testing? So that is what is the coverage of this session. So when we are talking about governance over stress testing, what are the various points that we are talking of? What are the key elements of it? Coming to the responsibilities of the board of directors as well as the senior management, what is the level of overlap, right, in their activities? What should be the responsibilities of the board? What should be the responsibilities of the senior management if at all the stress testing activity needs to be successful? Then how do you look at the policies, the procedures, the documentation aspects, etc. with respect to stress testing? How do you ensure that all these things are fully in place? What are the various policies need to be set? What are the various documentations and in what kind of mechanisms they need to be maintained? Then comes the validation aspects, right? What are the different policies or procedures you have in place if you want to validate a few stress tests that have been designed by the technical team? What is the process with respect to independent review? Independent review. It's not the same team who has developed or designed the test reviewing the test. So what are the ways in which you perform an independent review? Or regarding this, what is the governance aspect that is existing? What are the policies, processes in place? Then internal audit. What is the role of the internal audit team? In such a way, and here we are talking of exclusively with respect to stress testing only, and various aspects regarding the governance of stress testing. So these are the various things that we are going to take up in this session. So we know that stress testing is one of the important aspects in risk management today, right? Apart from value at risk and various other methods of determining the risk, the more and more stringent way of assessing the risk is through the stress testing. And very much essential today for the banks and various financial institutions to stress test their positions and have capital requirements accordingly. And so what is the role of governance out here? The first and foremost thing, they have to ensure that the stress tests are conducted in a rigorous manner. And it's very much required because first of all, stress tests are very highly technical. You make a large number of assumptions. You are designing a formula. In any stress testing activity, there are large number of assumptions. Each assumption could be challenged to the core, and you have lot of uncertainty in the result that is coming up. Everything is probabilistic in nature. So understanding the likelihood, the severity of the stressful event, should that particular event or scenario be considered or not, all these things should be very much discussed with the management. So that's the reason governance becomes a very important aspect here. How much control you have on the stress testing activity probably differs from country to country, financial institution to institution. But in general, when we are talking about effective governance and stress testing, we are talking of four major aspects. One relating to the governance structure, where we will be talking about the board of directors and the senior management, their roles in the process. Then policies, procedures, documents, whatever are there in place, to what extent they support the stress testing activity of the organization. Then how is the validation of the model done? How is the review of the model done? What are the kind of policies and procedures in place with respect to validation and review of the stress tests? And finally, the auditing process. So these four aspects come out as the standouts in any kind of governance aspect of stress testing, irrespective of what country we are talking of or what kind of financial institution we are specifying. So that's where we will start with our first aspect, which is the governance structure, is one of the most important elements. How the board of directors respond to it, how the senior management responds to it. We need a separation of duties between the board of directors and the senior management. We need a clear cut roles and responsibilities segregation between the two, because that will ensure that the one who is really responsible for a particular process is taking that particular process very seriously. Oversight will be a much proper oversight on an ongoing basis. So the major objective for board and senior management is come out with a very comprehensive, right, fully detailed, integrated, don't look at silos of different business lines. Take an integrated look of the overall firm, and effective stress testing fits into the overall risk management framework of the institution. So look at it at an enterprise level, look at it as an integrated level, come out with a comprehensive stress testing activity which can be used for organization as a whole, not for individual silo departments. So coming to the responsibilities, we may be knowing to a large extent the board of directors is responsible for key strategies and decisions. So they will have the ultimate responsibility for the stress testing as well, because they play a very important role in all the key strategies. They are the ones who have to define the culture of the organization. So the risk culture, etc., everything need to be defined by the board of directors. So they should be sufficiently knowledgeable about stress testing activities, not that they will sit and perform those activities, but to ask informed questions. So they should be aware of the entire process of stress testing to the core. And they have to ensure that whatever the stress test that we are conducting, whatever the activities that are going on in line with respect to stress testing, they are in line with the company's risk appetite. They have to compare it whether the activities that are being performed are in line with the risk appetite of the firm, are in line with the overall strategy of the company. So there should be some kind of ensuring that the activities are reflecting the overall risk appetite of the firm. And they have to review it very critically. Every activity that is being performed, the board is responsible for reviewing the activities, any assumptions, understand what all assumptions are made in designing the tests. They should be able to challenge the assumptions so that they get the best out of it. And information wise, they ensure that for whatever the assumptions that the person, that the team has made, there are proper information associated with it. Then coming to the results of the stress test, so whatever the decisions that they are taking with respect to capital adequacy, right? In terms of raising extra capital, or in terms of giving new kinds of loans or whatever, something to do with capital adequacy. All the decisions that are associated with the capital adequacy should be very well related with the results of the stress testing. Even the liquidity adequacy decisions also should come from the results of stress testing. That is where I can see that the stress testing is playing a role in the organization's overall risk management framework. So they should understand the various assumptions, the limitations of the stress test, and what are the various uncertainties that are coming out with respect to the tests. And it's just not the stress testing. They have to, I mean, stress testing should not be looked at separately altogether. Along with the stress testing, they should even focus on various other quantitative and qualitative methods. Try to compare stress testing, see where it fits into the overall framework of other quantitative and qualitative methods, and all the actions that are relating to capital, liquidity, risk management, any kind of exposure changes, any of these things, they should come purely from the stress testing itself. All these activities that the company is getting into, all these strategies that the company is getting into, everything should come from stress testing itself. And overall direction and strategy of the institution needs to be driven through stress testing only. Then, coming to the responsibility of the senior management, they should be looking at whatever the board has really discussed, whatever the board has really authorized with respect to stress testing activity. The senior management is more and more responsible to ensure that those activities are really performed. So they are accountable to the board. They should ensure that the stress testing activities are implemented and they have to report the same to the board. So they are responsible for coming out with ensuring that the policies, procedures, documentation is really adequate. They have the required number of resources, whether it is human resources or capital resources or software resources or whatever. So they should ensure that there are adequate number of resources. People who are working in stress management, stress testing, they are all competent people. So there should be an overseeing of the overall stress testing program. Ensure that it is implemented properly. The results of the stress testing, what are the interpretations, what are the outcomes of the stress test? So they need to evaluate the goodness of the results of the stress test. Any kinds of findings that are coming from each of the stress tests, they have to really link it with the functional aspect, and finally any kind of an action that needs to be taken based on the result, it has to be kicked off immediately. So these are some of the things, which means the execution part of it is majorly in the hands of senior management. The strategic part of stress testing is more in the hands of the board of governors. So they will be reporting to the board on the important developments that are coming in stress testing, right? What are the improvements that the teams have done with respect to the stress testing models? What are the new results out of the stress tests that are performed? And to what extent the compliance with the policies are there. So that's a kind of a regular reporting the senior management would be doing to the board to ensure that the stress testing is seriously implemented across all the levels in the organization. So different levels in the organization, they should be an appropriate buy-in. They should really feel that the stress testing is really essential to mitigate the risk and to improve the overall risk management process. So proper coordination between the various teams need to be ensured by the senior management. If the senior management does not show interest, obviously that concept does not get percolated into the organization, into the lower levels of the organization. So inconsistencies, if there are any across the various processes, any contradictory results that are coming up, they should be identified, they should be immediately assessed, and appropriate results also, appropriate action also need to be taken. And it's one of the important responsibility of the senior management to ensure that different kinds of stress testing activities, again, it should not be weird also. So that's where we are using the word sufficient. So if we are talking about assumptions, they should be realistic assumptions. Weird assumptions may not be required to perform a stress testing activity. So whatever the activities that are being performed, the senior management has to ensure that the sufficient range of test testing activities are applied at different levels, and enterprise-wide tests are also taken care of instead of just doing the testing at a silo business level. Even we are talking of stress testing results are appropriately aggregated at the entire enterprise level. So there should always be some kind of internal summary of the test results, the various outcomes that have come. So it's a kind of a listing or a tabulation of the various stress testing activities that are being performed, what are the outcomes of each of them, and based on each of the outcomes, what are the actions that are being taken by the senior management. So that kind of a log has to be maintained with the senior management. So along with the various other risk metrics that they are computing, like value at risk, etc., even the stress testing results also should be supplemented finally to look at the capital adequacy and liquidity adequacy. So they should have that basic amount of understanding or a good amount of understanding where they can explain the various elements of the stress testing activities. What are the assumptions that the teams have taken while developing the stress testing models? What are the limitations of the various models that they have developed? What are the uncertainties in the results associated with the models? All those things, the senior management should definitely have a clear idea about all of them. Ensure that the stress testing activities are updated, right, as and when the technology changes, as and when new risks come into picture, as and when the company is exposed to newer kinds of risks, new exposures do come up, new clients come up, new activities come up. Even there is a lot of research in the world of stress testing, so new stress testing procedures come up, new techniques come up. The senior management really needs to get updated in all these activities. Even the data sources come up. So there should be some kind of an updation to the stress testing activities when any of these things are coming up in the organization. Then the next aspect that we are looking at is the documentation per se. What should be the policies, procedures? First thing is, for any kind of a good governance, we should have policies and practices, procedures clearly documented. So that's an integral part of any kind of process. If it has to be a successful one, develop good policies, develop good procedures, maintain a huge documentation of all of them so that people can understand and follow them throughout the organization. So all these things, they should overall discuss the purpose of the stress testing. Why is this the company has got into the stress testing activity? Why is it essential? So different stress testing practices need to be documented. They should be consistent. There should be consistency in the stress testing practices that the company is following across the various departments. Roles and responsibilities should be clearly documented. What is the kind of control that we have over the external resources like vendors, data providers, etc. Right? What is the frequency at which we'll get the updates from them, and what the kind of control we have on all the sources of external information, and what is the frequency at which the stress testing is conducted. We need to have policies and procedures in place. In which order, which stress tests are conducted first and which tests are following that. So there should be clear cut process in place. So what are the conditions under which the stress test will be conducted? What are the various scenarios, right? Probably with respect to the stock prices, what are the scenarios we are going to create with respect to interest rates or any other macroeconomic variables? What are the various scenarios that we are going to create? So all those things, they should be clearly and consistently maintained in the form of documentation. And how is the validation of each of these tests performed, and who is going to review these tests? What is the process relating to the independent review? So there should be a lot of transparency to the third parties in terms of understanding the stress testing activities conducted within the organization. Then the focus is on the results. Who is going to use the stress testing results, and how are the results going to be used? What are the actions that can follow the stress testing and results understanding? So all these things are going to come out, and there should be each and every policy should be reviewed at regular intervals of time. If required, it needs to be updated so that it is very much relevant to the current scenario. It's up to date. As and when the market conditions are changing, if the stress testing activity needs to be revised, yes, it has to be revised. Product strategies of the company are changing. Again, there should be revision to the policies and the procedures. The company is getting exposed, the bank is getting exposed to different new risks, new activities, risk appetite is changing. In all these cases, even the policies, procedures, and the documentation needs to be updated. So all these things need to be properly documented with a proper log of historical changes. So the whole documentation should talk of what are all the various stress tests that the company is conducting, what is the method that they are using for each of the stress tests, on what kinds of data that they have used those tests, what are the assumptions that have gone into the tests, what are the results of the tests, what are the limitations, uncertainties, and finally what are the actions that they have taken based on the results. So the documentation is one of the essential aspects if the governance has to be more and more top notch. So the documentation at any point, it allows the management to track the results. Especially if I have this kind of document in place, they can very well go back, they can do the tracking of the result, see how they have been performing, how the stress tests are performing over the last 3 years, 5 years, and if at all they have changed any kind of methodologies or techniques in the middle. So what was the kind of change in the results before the change of the technique versus after the change of the technique? Any other things, even if the market conditions have changed, they can very well compare the results before the market conditions change versus after. All these things can really be compared and analyzed by the management. So proper documentation and the data maintenance is very much an essential aspect if the process has to be successful. And documentation wise, it allows the third parties to evaluate the stress tests. So there would be a proper validation if you are giving it for validation and independent review. Even when there is a documentation in place, even these validations and independent reviews can happen quite comfortably. So if the proper documentation is there in place, the operations, there will be a smooth flow of operations. Policies, compliance will come into picture, because if there is a policy that is document, I can always cross validate my actions with the policy and bring out what are all the discrepancies that are there. Any kind of improvements and recommendations need to be done. All those things can very well be compared and assessed if there is a full-fledged documentation in place. And it's a very useful tool for the developers of the stress tests, right? Because it gives a lot more clarity to the developers. What kind of tests? What are the various categories in which we already have the tests? What are the categories in which new tests need to be designed? All these things will become more and more clear to the developers of the stress test. So overall, documentation is playing needs to play a very important role in the governance aspect of stress testing. Then we will move on to understand the role of validation and independent review. So governance aspect should talk about how are they validating the different stress tests, what are the various independent reviews that are going to be performed on the various stress tests that are designed, the results of these stress tests, who is going to review them, how are they going to be reviewed, what is the validation procedure of each one of them. So there should be a proper governance aspect regarding these activities, because that is what will make the overall stress testing activity unbiased. It gives an additional assurance that whatever the stress testing activities that the company has designed and executed, they are functioning as intended. So it should not be a one-time activity. It should be a kind of an ongoing activity. Every stress test at different points in time, it requires a validation and independent review. One of the model, two of the results as well. And it should be integrated with the overall validation approach of the organization. It's not a silo piece. Stress testing has to be an integral part of the overall validation and the independent review that the company is doing with respect to its various other techniques and tools used for risk management purposes. And the only difference that you might observe is in case of stress tests, we are talking about very extreme kind of scenarios. So we may not have too huge a data which we have in case of the regular tests. For a regular test, the data that which we perform these tests are with a huge volume of data, because that much data is normally available. But in stress tests, we are giving some weird kind of scenarios as an input. So designing those inputs could be a much bigger challenge. So the events could be very rare in nature. But whatever it is, even if I test those stress tests on a normal data, I can very well compare it. I can very well come out with some kind of an assumption or some kind of a linkage between the data that is being used, the normal data being used versus rare and extreme data being used. How would the results typically change in these scenarios? And additional areas where the governance has to play a role with respect to validation. Everywhere there should be an independence, which means person who has designed and developed the test should not be involved in validating the tests or uh, reviewing the test results. So there should be a complete independence. And every assumption that is being used should be challenged effectively. The qualitative aspects of the stress test, judgmental aspects of the stress test, the assumptions that are made as a part of the stress test, they all need to be validated and reviewed. appropriate development standards should be there, and clear indication of why this particular stress test is performed, what is the objective of the stress test, this particular stress test, and what is the methodology that is being used. Is it really a robust methodology? And what are the processing components as a part of this test? All these things need to be done as a part of validation and review process. So what are all the limitations that are there with the current stress testing methodologies that they have developed? Even though they have used the best of the practices, it doesn't mean that they are effective for all kinds of scenarios. So all the team should be very comfortable in terms of understanding what is the limitation associated with each of these aspects. So data wise also, what are the limitations of the data? What is the quality of the data and what are the various weaknesses associated with it? All these things need to be understood from a governance perspective. And there should be an assurance that the stress tests are implemented in a rigorous manner. They are really implemented for whatever the objective for which they have typically designed, and any kind of changes that are coming up, they are adequately captured and documented. And the results of the stress testing need to be monitored on an ongoing basis. Even the models, even the results, there should be a kind of a monitoring on an ongoing basis, and at any point in time we see so many discrepancies cropping up, we see so much of degradation in the performance coming up. It's an indication that the model needs to be revised and updated. So the recommendations has to be given accordingly. And whatever is the accuracy of the stress test or inaccuracy of the stress test needs to be understood and documented, right? Whatever is the confidence intervals within which the results need to be verifying if they are within that confidence interval or deviating away from that interval, they all need to be studied and examined. And even if some kind of models are procured from third parties, even they need to be validated, they need to be tested for the appropriateness and use for the institution. So these are all the kinds of activities that the independent review should ensure regarding the stress test for effective governance of the same. Then coming on to the internal audit. Of course, for various activities, internal audit is a very essential aspect, and what we are saying is even for stress management, it has to be. So the various practices are typically evaluated as a part of the internal audit, and the focus is on various areas of risk management. And what we say is stress testing also should be one of it. So the audit team should provide an independent evaluation of how the various stress testing activities are being performed, what is the level of integrity across all the departments in the organization, what is the reliability of the stress testing activity that is being performed. Here we are not saying that they should get into and do the stress test, but they should have this level of understanding of questioning and challenging the assumptions that are typically being used by the stress testing team. So they have to look at the stress testing activities across the firm on the whole, see the kind of consistency, see the kind of appropriateness for the intended purpose, and ensure that they are not very outdated. They are a reflection of the current risks that are being taken by the organization itself. Even if required, get into the assessment of the resources who are working in the stress testing activities. Are they really capable enough? Are they really competent enough to design, develop and test the various stress testing activities within the organization? What are their roles and responsibilities? Any kind of changes that are coming up in the stress testing activities, are they properly documented? Are they properly reviewed? And are they approved by the competent authorities. What is the process in which the changes to the stress tests are being performed across the organization? Right? How is the validations going on? What are the independent reviews that are being conducted on the various stress testing activities? So all these things are the responsibilities of the internal audit staff. So they should have very much technical expertise, not to the core, but where they can ask the right questions. So they should be able to understand the stress test, the results of the stress test, and the challenging and questioning the assumptions being used and the methodology being used, etc. So the audit team should be able to review in a manner that they are able to identify the deficiencies in the stress testing process. They are logging all those deficiencies. The improvement activities are tracked and remediated. So on a whole, whether all the stress testing activities are functioning as intended, whatever the policies and procedures that are being set, is it that the activities relating to stress testing are in line with those policies and procedures? That's again an important role of the internal audit. Then moving on to one more aspect regarding the governance of stress testing, we have to understand a few important dimensions. One being the coverage. The word is very clear. What is the coverage of the stress test? What proportion of the various scenarios are being looked at? So I need an appropriate coverage, right? If I don't have a full coverage, there is a good, if I'm taking only a part of the data and based on that I'm performing my stress test, there is a chance of false sense of comfort. I did not include all the portfolios in the computation of stress tests. I did not include all my exposures, only a part of them are being included. All the activities are not being included for doing the stress testing. So I'm not looking at an enterprise level or an integrated level, but I'm looking at more of a department level kind of stress test. So in those cases, the coverage is not adequate, and because of that reason, I may get into a false sense of comfort that the not too many risks are coming out as a part of my process. So the more the appropriate the coverage is, it needs to be documented properly, what each stress is covering and what each stress test does not cover. So the ins and outs, the in scope versus out of scope of each of the stress tests need to be understood very carefully. And effective stress testing at various levels, various departments, it has to be performed, but along with that, even an enterprise level consolidation needs to be done. So it can be at an individual exposure level or an instrument level. I can apply it department wise and then enterprise wise, or different kinds of individual exposures and then aggregations. But we need to understand what all are covered and what all are not covered, right? And there should be an understanding of various exposures, the correlations between them, the combined effects, the portfolio effect that they are going to give, the diversification benefits each of them is going to give. All those things need to be included as a part of the coverage. Stress testing several types of risks and business lines simultaneously could be a challenging activity. So, but still, unless I look at it at a complete picture at an organization level, understanding the relationships between the various business lines, I may not achieve the level of adequacy and the level of conformity as required. So the stress tests need to be conducted over relevant time horizons. There should be a time frame for conducting the different stress tests. The different conditions need to be captured, short term, long term, all these things need to be focused as a part of the various stress testing activities. So this is where one dimension that needs to be looked at in case of stress testing is ensure that the coverage is adequate. Then we talk about different types and approaches of stress testing. So whatever the tests that we are using, they are very, very relevant, in line with the direction and the strategy that is set by the board. And internal as well as external stakeholders should be able to believe it. They should develop some kind of credibility in the stress testing process that we are implementing in our organization. So at least some of the scenarios should be challengeable. The more and more I challenge, the more goodness of the models are expected to come out. So impact, firm specific and systemic stress events. So firm specific stress events need to be included. Profitability of the firm going very, very bad, right? Or one or two key customers not paying their credits, not paying on time, or some vendor refused to supply the material suddenly. So these are all firm specific stress events, but at the same time we have systemic stress events coming up. All these things need to be adequately captured and scenarios need to be created accordingly, and based on that the tests and the results need to be reviewed and interpreted. And all these scenarios design should be based on historical experience as well as hypothetical occurrences. But at the same time, they should not be so vague that the probability of their occurrence is pretty much minimal, but we bother a lot about those kind of events occurring. So there should be a consideration on the incremental as well as cumulative effects of the stress conditions. When new risks are getting added, new exposures are getting added, there is a possibility of diversification, but at the same time there is a possibility of the new risk adding up, magnifying the overall risky scenario rather than acting as any kind of a diversification aspect. So that is one more area where with respect to types and approaches that we are implementing, the focus should be on. When you are conducting a stress test at an enterprise level, the aggregation of the results from all the various individual business departments and various individual business lines, the procedures of aggregation need to be taken care of. The same set of assumptions for the chosen scenario have to be used consistently across the organization. Otherwise, because of the change in the assumptions, the results might be different and the interpretations may go different. But if I am using the same consistent assumption for all the areas, it even improves the overall consistency across all the departments. And consideration should be given to the reverse stress, break the bank. So to really understand at what level, what scenario there could be a kind of complete bankruptcy to the bank. We are going completely beyond the normal business expectation, so we really want to see a reverse engineering process out here. Under what scenario the bank can go completely bankrupt. So where could the viability of the bank really get under threat? So that should be the kind of tests that need to be designed so that proper actions could be taken accordingly, and the surprising results could quite comfortably be avoided. And coming to capital and liquidity related stress testing. So it should always be conducted in coordination with the overall strategy of the information of the institution and the annual planning cycle. So it has to be a kind of a coordination activity. And whatever the results that have come up, every strategic decision the company is announcing, we should really see what is the capital and what is the liquidity adequacy coming out with each of the new decision that the company has taken. And I also need to consider how the losses, earnings, cash flows, capital and liquidity would be affected in which multiple risks are existing. Right? Are they going to have a diversification benefit, or are they going to really magnify? So an increment in the credit losses during an adverse risk interest rate environment. So interest rate wise, the value of the portfolios might typically go down, but at the same time even the credit risk might also come up. So the kind of correlation that is existing between the two, or probably a cupola kind of a model between the two, needs to be built to understand how the joint movement across these various risks come up, and how they could magnify the overall impact and how they could challenge the capital and the liquidity levels of the organization. So the stress testing, we all know it can aid in contingency planning. So help the managing the identify various exposures or risks in advance. Capital and liquidity positions can very well be planned and improved. So that's one of the major aspects that go into the stress testing. And stress testing should also assess the potential impact of various subsidiaries which could have an impact, not just the main the holding firm. We are talking about the various subsidiaries that could really have capital and liquidity problems. So their impact on the parent firm also need to be evaluated very stringently. Effective stress testing should explore the potential for capital and liquidity problems to arise at the same time or exacerbate one another. There is a possibility of multiple problems coming up at the same time. Now, the focus really need to be on addressing what is the possibility of such kind of problems cropping up and what are the remedies associated with each one of them. So there are various aspects that governance has to look at with respect to effective implementation of the stress testing within the organization. So that is what I wanted to cover as a part of this session. If you have any further queries regarding this, you can very well get in touch with me by sending me an email at the email address that I have provided below, or you can give me a call on the number that I have provided below. Thanks a lot for listening to this session. Thank you very much.